I've become totally obsessed with this new shape, but so far I've only made small versions of them. This week though, I want to change that, and so first I'm going to be throwing the relatively curved form before trimming it into a much more angular shape. It's still raining, it feels like it's never going to stop, but a cosy day on the wheel throwing pots is a good remedy as long as I can ignore the drips coming through the roof in a few places. I normally quite like the winter in the workshop, with the low light, long shadows, and the heating on to keep the space nice and toasty, but not this year. Now, the shapes in question are these angular bowls. They're thrown completely curved initially, and then they're trimmed back to have a more angular exterior. And by doing this, these pots can have both a curved form on the inside and the sharp, angular, more Florian Gadsby shape on the outside. So it's the best of both worlds, really. I think these shapes will scale up wonderfully, provided I can get the proportions right. I'll make a couple of them just in case, so that I have a few attempts, but I think given these have such a tall foot, which acts almost like a pedestal of sorts, these could end up as quite large sculptural pieces, especially compared to those smaller vessels I create, such as those in front of you now. The great thing about the indented rim these have is that it helps the form keep its shape as compared to walls of a pot if they're just straight. This means I'll be able to make these quite large and with thin lips without having to worry too much, I hope, about them distorting. So I'm back to using really hot water to throw with, and for these I'm going to be mixing a batch of really soft reclaim with some very firm bagged clay I've had sitting in the studio for a year now. I'll be cut wedging the two stonewares together, as spiral wedging them would be a pain in more ways than one. It doesn't need to be perfect at this stage, I just make sure to squeeze in as many layers as I can and make sure there's a piece of firm clay on the top and bottom. This way when I begin to cut wedge it, it doesn't just immediately stick to the table. I go through this process about 22 or 23 times. At that point there are millions of layers of clay, meaning that in terms of texture the two different consistencies should be fully blended. Also, at this point there shouldn't be any pockets of air left. I then weighed out a 4 kilo lump, which is just under 9 pounds of clay, and despite already being wedged thoroughly to bring together the weighed out pieces, I'll spiral wedge this lump up to fully amalgamate them. I also make sure there are no crevices in the bottom and rock it around in a circle on the tabletop to fully smooth it. This way when I chuck it onto the wheelhead, the lump of clay doesn't trap any air beneath it. I seal it around the base with a finger and then spend some time patting it into shape. It's amazing just how much centering you can do before you actually put any water on it. I generally begin by just grabbing the lump, pulling it up into a cone and then pressing it down. This initial cone is never neat unless you're using really soft clay, but I'd say this mass is on the slightly firm side. Plenty of water is needed at this stage, as you're squeezing so hard that the water and slip beneath your hands really quickly dry out. And when I press it down, I almost centre it from the top, with my ultimate goal being to press it into a flat disc, puck-like shape, with a flat top and flat sides. Something that resembles this, more or less, and if I keep my hands resting on it as it spins around, they should be completely stationary, as in the piece of clay beneath shouldn't influence their movement in any way. That's when you know it's centered. The next step is to open up a hollow in the center of the piece of clay, which I initially do with a finger and thumb before switching to using most of the fingers of my left hand, with my right hand braced on top to push it down with. Now, the bases of these bowls have a tremendous amount of clay left in them, so I'll be leaving the base of this vessel really thick, so that there's plenty of material left in that pedestal that holds the bowl up. As this is a bowl, after all, the internal base is left curved at this stage, meaning there isn't a ton of work to do, like there can be when forming the base of a cylinder. I then collar the wall up from the outside just to spread out the thickness of the vessel a bit, and to pull up much of the excess weight that sat within that ring around the bottom. If I didn't do this and started by pulling the walls up like I normally might, there would be such a thick expanse of clay between my fingers on the outside and inside, I'd have to squeeze a lot in order to get it moving. But by thinning it out like this and by lifting with my palm, most of those initial difficulties can be avoided. And with that done, I can begin pulling properly using a sponge on the outside and my fingertips on the inside. I hold one of these mud tool sponges in my right hand that's soaked in water and I press it in towards the bottom, creating an indent all the way around. Then, on the inside, just above this by about 2 centimeters or so, I press my fingers out where that bump is. Then, as one, both hands move up together, that wetted sponge essentially lifting up that band of clay. If I can reach both my fingertips towards the bottom and keep my thumb clasped around the rim, I will, as this way I can keep the lip stabilised as I'm pulling up, and then when my lifting hand gets high enough, I can brace it with my thumb, connecting the two and stabilising them even further. I'll keep on doing this until the pot is more or less the right height, and you may have noticed that I'm purposefully leaving the rim relatively thick. This does two things. The first thing it does is stabilise the pot, as compared to say a really thin rim that would be prone to buckling and deforming as you work. Now the second reason I need it to be thick is because as I stretch the rim out, it will naturally get thinner, and ultimately I still need some material in the rim to throw that indentation with. Had I made the rim thin initially, when I stretched it out, it would likely split, and there's also absolutely no way I could throw the indentation I want. I think widening the bowl, what I'm doing here, is probably the hardest part, as any tiny alteration in speed or pressure with your hands will create a subtle undulation in the wall. Now, I don't worry if there is a slight undulation in the walls. As long as it's not too bad and I can control it, I should be able to deal with it completely at the leather hard stage, which I'll do by trimming away the uneven movement. To indent the rim, I first wet the top, and then I simply press my fingers in, almost as if I'm throwing it. I take it slow and pinch gently, and keep that pressure held for a small amount of time so that it's applied to the entire surface of the lip as it spins and passes through my hand. And with the rough shape there, I can begin scraping off most of the slip that covers this piece. I press out gently from the inside against the plastic kidney, and the joy is, as I'm not having to think about an angular shape yet, all I'm doing is throwing a smooth, even curve from bottom to top. The next step is to use a sharp kidney to define the angular section at the top. Now, doing this normally makes any undulation in the rim blindingly obvious, but I will be able to remove the worst of that at this stage. I should note that I'm also really careful to not make the wall too thin here, as when trimming the pot, this section still has to support the entire weight of the vessel. The lip is then chamoised smooth, and I hold my hand steady enough with that small piece of leather so that any movement in the rim has to conform to the shape I'm pressing onto it. There are two more things left to do. The first is to remove the slip from the inside and to scrape clean the walls. This is something I do quite carefully at this stage, as if I press out too firmly, it can quite easily change the shape of the pot. And in many ways, if I can't get it perfect at this stage, I'd feel much more comfortable properly fixing it after the clay has turned leather hard, as then it will be far more difficult to distort the shape of the bowl. The other thing I've got to do is tidy up the base. This involves scraping away the excess clay carefully so that it doesn't bunch up on the turning tool and collide with the walls above it, potentially deforming them. I'm then going to give it a really good blast with a heat gun, just to take the edge off, especially around the base. This way I can lift it off the wheel without it distorting. I use a twisted metal wire to separate it from the wheel head, and then I press my fingers lightly into the foot and lift it away, placing it onto a bat. This way I can move it around without actually having to touch the pot. And with one thrown, I'm going to make two more like it. And I'm not measuring these, instead I'm just roughly throwing them to the same shape. These are just the blanks, really, as there's still a lot more to do to them at the leather hard stage. It's now about 2 days later, and I really need to trim them today, as I'm about to go on a very short holiday. So they need to be dried out quickly. It's not the best method, but it works. The banding wheels underneath them means I can spin them easily, which I do every 15 minutes or so. This way one side doesn't dry out too much. I also put some plastic on them, protecting the rims, so those parts don't dry out too much. And the last place that was a tiny bit damp was the bottom of the inside, so that was given a quick blast with a heat gun, too. As you can see, the rim is wavering a bit, so I'm going to do what I always do, which is flip the pot upside down and trim the base to be level. This way the undulation in the rim is translated into the foot, and then when flipped back the right way round, it should at least spin flat. Although there is also another undulation in this piece. In fact, all three of these bowls had some movement in the walls. I was able to work with the first two and finish them, but the movement in the walls in the third piece was a bit too much. But at least I was able to cut it in half to see a rather wonderful cross section, and I'll include that footage at the end of the video. I try not to remove too much clay here, as ultimately that will remove height from the bowl, but as soon as it is spinning completely level, it's turned back the right way up. I check to see how level it is in the mirror in front of me. And if I am happy with it, I'll brush some slip down onto the wheel head and place the bowl onto this. The slip quickly sticks to the tacky clay on the base of the bowl, and via the tap centering process and the friction this creates, the slip also quickly dries, sticking the pot down incredibly firmly. The first thing I do is try and push the rim out ever so slightly so it loses that wavering motion it has. I won't be able to nullify it completely, but I should be able to get rid of the worst of it. The next thing I do is scrape clean the interior. Not a lot, just to even things out, and to get rid of any of the more prominent throwing rings. Next, and I should always really start by doing this, is that way I would only have to clean up the scraps from the inside once. I trim the inside of the rim so it's really sharp and flat, and then I mirror that on the outside, defining both angles at the top and making sure the groove where they meet is really crisp, whilst also not being too thin, as again, the rim on this has to support the underside of this pot when it's flipped, upside down. But strangely perhaps, I'm actually going to do a majority of the shaping with the bowl this way round, as I feel like I can see its proportions more clearly, together with trimming away that curved shape to make something more angular. It also means there's going to be less weight put on the delicate rim later on. I can even remove rather a lot of clay from the foot, narrowing it to more closely resemble the smaller bowls I showed you at the start. If you look closely, you can see the line around the waist is wavering slightly. This isn't because I'm trimming it badly, this is because the pot inherently had a slight undulation in it, meaning that the wall on one side was further out than the other. And it's a really difficult thing to fix, as to correct it you have to remove more clay from one side than the other, and if there just isn't enough clay in the walls to make this correction, it's practically impossible to solve, and that's precisely what happens on the piece I'm going to cut in half later on. For now though, there isn't much more clay to remove at this stage, rather I'm just trying to define the angles and to make them crisper and more pronounced. The part that has to be trimmed the most though is the foot. There's probably a good 4 centimeters of clay inside this that needs to be turned away, and inevitably the stoneware inside is going to be softer, which yes, will make it easier to remove in some ways, but it also means the clay will stick back to itself, which can be a pain, and it also makes it much easier to carve a hole accidentally into the base of the piece, as there's less resistance. I take the entire process of hollowing out the foot carefully, but this first pass is done with excessive care, as it's at this stage that I sort of set the boundary of the foot. This way, when I do subsequent passes, I know precisely where to stop, as surprisingly it's rather easy to get carried away, or for the blade to catch, tearing away more clay than I'd like. And if that clay that's gouged away is from the side of the foot, it can be practically irreparable. So I always remove the blade before I actually get to the wall itself, and despite the vertical section looking scruffy and full of grooves, I'll come back to fix this later on. For now though, I'm just concerned about trimming the depth. I then switch my focus onto tidying up the side. Well, flattening it, really. Due to the size of this bowl, I can't make the foot too small and flimsy, as not only does it kind of prop up and support the rest of the shape, but if I were to make the actual portion that sits on the kiln shelf too small, the chance that it warps and loses shape is far greater. So it's left to be relatively robust, so it can survive being fired up to cone 10. The next thing I do is burnish the foot portion smooth using a plastic kidney. As this will be the only portion of exposed clay on the finished piece, I finish it to be as smooth and even as I can. And lastly, of course, stamping it with my maker's mark. I then pick the bowl up and place it onto a wooden bat. I then place a high pressure laminate bat onto its foot and flip the entire assemblage over. There is still some subtle movement in it, but as soon as the wheel stops spinning, you won't notice it anymore. Here it is in comparison to a slightly shorter piece that hasn't been trimmed yet, and whilst I was happy with it, some of the lines didn't feel as crisp as they could be, especially the one around the waist, so I placed it back on the wheel, not with the intent of removing tons of clay, but to further define the areas where the angles change. Here it is with its little brother. They match quite nicely, I think. And I'll be drying these slowly beneath plastic whilst I go away for a few days. Here's the second one I trimmed. It's slightly wider and the body section tapers more. And finally, here's the one I mucked up. You can see that the lower portion of the wall is undulating quite a lot already, and despite my best effort at trying to fix it, I ended up not being particularly happy with the shape, but at least that meant I was able to cut it in half, which was a very satisfying process. Although pushing through the thick foot was a bit of a challenge. Perhaps I should have trimmed it out before trying to cut it in half, but at least this will give you a good idea of how much clay is left in the foot initially. It demonstrates rather well the difference a slight undulation makes, as it meant that I could remove more clay from one side than the other, and in my attempt to fix this, it meant that I had to try and remove more clay from one side than the other, thus creating a patch that was way too thin towards the base. Anyhow, that's all this week. Thank you so much for taking your time to watch, especially if you made it this far. And, as always, I'll see you next time.